Okay, I'm going to call the next speaker, a very special speaker. You will see yourself, a unique speaker. He will talk about lesson learned about supply chain cybersecurity during COVID-19. He's senior advisor with CISA, cyber safety innovation fellow with the Atlantic Council, leader with the Am The Cavalry grassroots initiative. His name is Beau Woods. Beau Woods, you are more than welcome to come to the stage.
This is going to be a somewhat interactive conversation. So I know that Israelis don't have a reputation for being shy. And for those of you at home watching or watching the recording, just feel free to shout it out to your screens as well. Who can tell me what this is? MRI, somebody said. Somebody got it right. MRI. And this is, of course, an invaluable tool in diagnostics and healthcare. It was almost 2 years ago that we found out that these types of devices, I don't know if this one specifically, but these types of devices had several critical vulnerabilities. The US Food and Drug Administration issued some warnings, and some other organizations talked about the importance of updating. But that's not the remarkable thing. Who knows what this is? Playing along at home? An F-22. This is state-of-the-art military hardware. And about 3 months after we found out that the MRI was vulnerable, we found out that some of the software in this plane was also potentially vulnerable. Now, we don't know because all the information about it is classified, but what could make those two very different platforms vulnerable to the exact same thing? Well, I expect this audience has heard of this, Urgent 11. Urgent 11 was a set of vulnerabilities that were announced just before Black Hat that I'm sure for many of you sent you scrambling to update systems, or for those systems that couldn't be updated, sent you scrambling to build in better protections or to scrap them for something better. And you might ask, why are those two very different types of systems vulnerable? Well, the answer is supply chain security. Now, very few people had heard of this company until the vulnerabilities were released. But they had a really powerful IP stack that they licensed to absolutely everybody before they got acquired by VxWorks in, I think, around 2006. And because of that, their software was in everything. And so when vulnerabilities appeared in that software, or were discovered in that software, everything that had that software in it, including MRI machines and military hardware, also inherited those vulnerabilities. Now, the Atlantic Council put out a year ago, in June, I believe, an analysis of the past decade of known documented supply chain security, cybersecurity attacks. And there were about 100 in this study. And you can see they're really all across the development process for systems, for software systems. This was a really good study. If you want to go look at it and check it out, you can see exactly where some of these vulnerabilities pop up. Now, in the last year since that study was published, we've probably had another 30 or 40 announced. Some people think that the 2020s are going to be the year of the supply chain vulnerability, and I think that that may be the case. This was the last in-person event that many people attended just before COVID. It was the end of February 2020, and this was the RSA conference. I run an event out there called the Supply Chain Sandbox. And in the Supply Chain Sandbox, we try and take supply chain principles and make them easy to understand, easily digestible. You can see this is the head of CISA at the time, Chris Krebs, sitting down and playing a game where you use Jenga blocks to build a tower, and then supply chain attacks knock the tower down. And based on some of the conversations that we had there, he invited me to come and act as a senior advisor to CISA once COVID started to help secure the COVID response supply chain. So here's what a vaccine supply chain looks like at a very high level view. Now, this covers everything from the research and development all the way to getting shots in arms. And there's a lot of organizations or stops on this supply chain that may be familiar to you. Manufacturing is obviously critical. Logistics and transportation is critical. Some of these may be less familiar. Fill and finish, kitting. Those are terms that I had to learn as I was going through this. There's also some commonalities across this. For instance, electricity. Well, obviously electricity and software. Those go through all of it. Cold chain, cold storage. We discovered that the vaccines need to be stored in a very cold environment. So you have to get it to minus 20 or minus 80 degrees centigrade. But that's also a common supply chain characteristic of vaccines. And what we found as we started looking through this, and all of these examples are publicly documented, is every single stop along the way, adversaries were targeting and successfully attacking the organizations that make up this supply chain. We found that as the critical parts of vaccine development, delivery were changing, adversaries changed who they targeted. They were very progressive, and they had many motivations. It wasn't just nation states looking to do harm. It wasn't just criminals trying to make money. It wasn't just adversaries looking to get a jump start on vaccine production. It was all of those, and all of those in different combinations. So in some cases, you had multiple adversaries going after the same types of organizations at same time or different times. And one of the things we discovered is we found some stops on the supply chain, some organizations that we didn't expect to find. We were learning as some of these organizations were getting hit or being targeted that one of our main organizations that was helping to deliver vaccines would call us up and say, hey, these guys are important to us. We'd like to see if you can help them out. So lessons learned from this. And this is not just from a CISA perspective. By the way, I'm not here in my CISA capacity, here in my personal capacity, but I'm bringing lessons from around the world that have been learned. The first one is a shift from sectors to functions. So critical infrastructure sectors, we're all very familiar with those. These are organizations that tend to group together because they have common threats, common business models, common technology platforms, a lot of commonalities. And so it makes sense for those to group together. But what we tend to find is that those groups can be overly broad. So if everything is critical, then nothing is critical. You can't prioritize enough in some cases with critical infrastructure sector view. And as the OECD and CISA and others have done, we started looking at what's called national critical functions. And the supply chain diagram I just showed you is a good example of how those might manifest. This is a different look, and this is out on CISA's website. You can go check this out. But essentially, what is core to the nation? What are the things that we pride, that we value, that we need to keep running? And then how do we break those down into discernible, discrete steps that we can protect? Second, we need to define what critical software is. And this is in the executive order that came out in May of this year. It was a key part of that executive order. We need to define what critical software is. What does it mean to protect critical software? And in some ways, you might have the same type of issues with the critical infrastructure sectors, because defining it turns out to be really hard. Everybody kind of knows it when they see it. For instance, operating systems like Linux, like Windows, like the two real-time operating systems that I referenced earlier in the jet and the medical device. Those are clearly going to be critical systems for most applications. This, a SCADA control system, you might also expect that will be critical software. And yes, it is critical software. It's powering something critical. In this case, this looks like a turbine maybe from a power plant. What about something like iTunes? Well, probably not, unless iTunes is running on your critical infrastructure software. So it turns out it's really hard to define. NIST has published some guidance on that, but we're still kind of figuring out what this means. The third I want to talk about is the idea of software transparency. How do you know that you've got iTunes as a critical part of one of your systems? Or how do you know that you may have a vulnerability in a real-time operating system that's several layers deep in the supply chain? Well, you have to be able to see into it. You have to have some transparency. And so one of the tenets also of the executive order is the idea of a software bill of materials. Now, this is an idea that goes back Even into the late 90s, there were people who were starting to talk about the idea of tracking software like we track hardware. And a lot of those ideas have come from even older ideas, going back to W. Edwards Deming and some of his work in the manufacturing and specifically in automaking in Toyota in the 1970s and 80s. And it's an oversimplified version is that it's something like an ingredients list for software. So instead of may contain nuts, you might say may contain struts. And this is a real example. Several financial institutions found out that they were running struts when they were getting hit by adversaries that were targeting struts. So I may have a couple of minutes for questions. I'm not sure. But with that, thank you very much. And I'll see you tomorrow morning on the same stage at B-Sides TLV.